In 1876, three furniture makers from a Michigan town of roughly 30,000 people carried their work to the Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia and beat the established furniture houses of the East Coast. All three took medals. All three came home to a town that had never advertised outside its own county. All three helped attach a single phrase to a single place for the next 70 years, a phrase that meant quality, the way a hallmark means silver. Grand Rapids furniture became the standard against which every other American maker was measured, in showrooms from Boston to San Francisco, by buyers who had never set foot in Michigan and never needed to. By 1900, more than 40 furniture companies operated along the banks of the same river, and for the better part of a century, the industry did not simply belong to the city. The city was named for it. By 1980, that title belonged to a town in North Carolina that most of those original buyers had never heard of. The factories along the Grand River stood with their windows dark, brick shells the size of city blocks, empty of the trade that had built them. A city that had spent 100 years teaching America what fine furniture looked like had lost the industry it was named for, in less time than it took to win it. What did not happen next is the part of the story most factory towns cannot tell. Grand Rapids did not become a ruin. It found something else to build, and it built it well enough that the city is growing today while much of the state around it shrinks. This is the story of a crown that came off, and a city that kept standing without it. Chapter 1. The River That Fell 18 Feet. Before Grand Rapids was a furniture town, before it was any kind of town at all, it was a stretch of the Grand River where the water dropped 18 feet over a bed of limestone and shale in less than a mile. Geologists would later map the feature with more precision than anyone in 1826 needed. What mattered to the people who eventually settled there was simpler. Falling water is free power. And 18 feet of fall across a wide, reliable river was more power than most towns in the Michigan Territory would ever have access to. The site was not chosen for a harbor. A crossroads had nothing to do with it, and neither did any fort. It was chosen because the river did something useful at that exact point and nowhere else nearby. Pine forests stood on both banks and ran for miles in every direction. Tall stands of white pine that would later feed a lumber economy nobody in 1826 was thinking about yet. Gypsum lay in beds under the ground a few miles east, soft white rock that could be mined, burned, and ground into plaster, though it would be decades before anyone bothered. And the river itself did not simply flow past the rapids and disappear into the interior. It ran west into Lake Michigan, and Lake Michigan ran south to Chicago and north through the strait at Mackinac into the entire trading network of the Great Lakes. A settlement at the rapids was not isolated. It had power on one side of it and a continent of waterborne commerce on the other, connected to both by a single unbroken channel. In November 1826, a French-descended trader named Louis Campeau arrived from Detroit and put up a cabin, a trading post, and a blacksmith shop on the east bank beside the rapids. Detroit in the 1820s was itself a small town by Eastern standards, but it was the commercial hub of the Michigan Territory, the place where a trader gathered credit, goods, and information before heading into the interior. Campeau had grown up in the fur trade the way many Detroit-area French families had, moving goods and credit along the western edge of American settlement for most of his adult life, and he understood what the rapids offered before there was anything resembling a town to recognize it alongside him. He did not stay through the winter to build anything larger. He went back to Detroit before the ice closed the river. He returned the following year with his wife and $5,000 in trade goods, a substantial outlay for a single-family operation on the Michigan frontier in 1827, and set up to trade directly with the Odawa and the Ojibwa bands who worked the surrounding country for fur. The arrangement ran in both directions. Campeau needed furs to sell east. The Odawa and Ojibwa needed the manufactured goods, cloth, tools, and provisions that only a trader with connections back to Detroit could reliably bring in. Fur was the currency that connected the Michigan interior to markets in the East. For more than a decade, that exchange was the entire economy of the place, conducted out of a cabin and a trading post beside a waterfall that nobody had yet found a second use for. Growth after that was slow by any modern measure, and steady by the measure of the Michigan frontier. A handful of additional families arrived through the early 1830s, drawn by the same combination of river power and river access that had drawn Campow. None of them arrived because of the fur trade. They arrived because the same fall of water that had drawn Campow could, in principle, run something larger than a blacksmith's forge. By 1838, the settlement had become a recognized village. Still small, still built mostly of log and rough-sawn lumber, but no longer a single trading post standing alone beside the water. And the rapids that had given the place its name were no longer only a feature of the landscape. They were already turning the wheels of the first sawmills built along the east bank, cutting the pine that stood on every side of the village into boards faster than the village itself had any use for. That surplus, boards nobody in the settlement needed yet, would turn out to matter more than the fur trade ever had. Chapter 2. The first fortune was never furniture. The first fortune to come out of Grand Rapids was not a chair, a table, or a carved sideboard. It was a plank of white pine, and for the better part of 30 years, it was the only product the Rapids were known for. The forests standing on every side of the settlement were among the densest pine stands in the Great Lakes Basin, and the river that dropped 18 feet across the rapids was, in practical terms, a free engine sitting in the middle of town. Trees were cut upstream through the winter, dragged to the riverbank on sledges, and released into the current with the spring thaw. The Grand River did the hauling. The rapids did the cutting. All that remained was to build the mills, to catch the logs, and by the late 1830s and through the 1840s, that is exactly what happened, one water wheel at a time, along both banks of the rapids. A sawmill, once it is running, does not stay a solitary structure for long. It needs sawyers to feed the blade, teamsters to move the cut lumber, and cooks and shopkeepers to feed and supply all of them. Sawmills wanted labor. Labor wanted housing. Housing wanted stores, churches, and streets to connect them. And within a decade, the difference between a trading post beside a rapids and an actual town had been settled entirely by the sound of saw blades. The population that arrived to work the mills was not passing through. It stayed, married, and raised children who grew up with sawdust in the yard and log booms on the river, and who understood what pine wood did under a blade and what it was worth once it was cut straight. Picture the east bank of the Grand River on an ordinary morning in the early 1850s. The rapids run white under a haze of mist that never quite lifts before noon. Log booms stretch upstream as far as the bend allows, pine trunks lashed together and waiting their turn at the chute. The mills themselves are low, wide buildings roofed in shingle, their water wheels turning without pause from first light until the last raft has been sawn. Piles of fresh-cut boards stand stacked along the bank in yellow rows, still sweating sap, and the smell of resin sits over the waterfront the way smoke sits over a foundry town. Men move between the piles calling weights and grades to one another. None of it looks like an industry that will one day be famous for chairs. It looks like exactly what it is, a lumber camp that has learned to stand still. That, and not the timber itself, turned out to be the accident that mattered. The pine would eventually run out, and it did. What the sawmills left behind first was not lumber at all. It was people who knew wood the way other towns knew wheat or ore, men who had spent years reading grain, judging moisture, and coaxing a straight edge out of a rough plank. A resource had built a workforce, and the workforce would outlast the resource. By the 1850s, a handful of cabinet makers working in shops behind the mill district had begun to notice something the sawmill owners had not been selling: surplus. Furniture, unlike lumber, is heavy, awkward, and easily damaged, which is why it had always been made close to the customer who bought it, town by town, in small shops that never shipped their work farther than a wagon could travel in a day. Grand Rapids had two things those small shops elsewhere did not. It had more sawn stock sitting on the riverbank than the local market could use, priced to move. And it had the Grand River itself, running north to Lake Michigan, and Lake Michigan running onto Chicago, and the freight network of the Great Lakes. A finished chair could leave the rapids by water and reach a buyer 300 miles away in better condition than a wagon could deliver it 30 miles down a dirt road. A craft becomes an industry the moment distance stops being a limit, and in Grand Rapids that moment arrived because the transport already existed, built for lumber and repurposed, almost incidentally, for furniture. Orders began arriving from outside the county. Nobody in the mill district in 1855 could have said where that habit was headed. In 21 years, it would carry 3 of them to Philadelphia. Chapter 3: The Town That Never Had to Advertise Again. The Centennial exhibition opened in Philadelphia in May 1876. 180 acres built to mark the first 100 years of the United States. Nearly 10 million admissions passed through the gates before it closed that November. The largest gathering the country had ever assembled in one place. The main exhibition building alone covered more than 20 acres of floor, and furniture makers from Boston, New York, and Philadelphia filled a good share of it with display cases built to be looked up at rather than sat in. Those firms carried 100 years of Eastern buyers behind them. What Grand Rapids carried was 3 exhibitors and a river town nobody east of Detroit had reason to know by name. The 3 did not send furniture built for a showroom. They sent furniture built the way they built it every day, and the difference was the point. Berkey and Gay carried a Renaissance Revival suite, heavily carved, the wood worked into scroll work deep enough to throw shadow under gaslight, a piece that took a trained hand weeks rather than days. It stood in a hall crowded with the best the East Coast trade could produce, and it did not read as provincial work straining to keep pace. It read as work that had already caught up. Visitors touring the aisles kept stopping in front of the piece from Michigan, and by the time the judges finished their rounds, all 3 Grand Rapids exhibitors held medals, standing on ground the Eastern houses had never before had to defend. A medal at a World's Fair is a small object. What it does to a reputation is not, and the mechanism is worth naming. A buyer standing in a Boston showroom in 1877 did not need to have walked the Philadelphia floor to trust a piece stamped Grand Rapids. He only needed to know it had beaten the houses he already trusted, on a stage too large for the outcome to be dismissed as local pride. Word of a Centennial medal traveled through trade journals faster than any advertisement the town could have bought, without a single Michigan manufacturer knocking on an Eastern door. The 3 companies came home to a town that had never advertised outside its own county, and it would not need to for the rest of the century. A phrase attached itself to the place that year, Grand Rapids Furniture, and the phrase sold more than any catalog could. Quality, proven once in public, verifies itself. The town understood what it was sitting on faster than most towns manage, and in 1878, it moved to make the advantage permanent, staging its first furniture market. Instead of waiting for buyers to discover the town's reputation secondhand, bring the buyers to the source and let them see the season's new designs laid out under one roof before any of it reached a store shelf elsewhere. Buyers came from Chicago, from Cincinnati, from cities that had never sent a purchasing agent to Michigan for any other reason. They came twice a year after that, spring and fall, on a schedule as fixed as a harvest and the market did what the metals alone could not. It turned Grand Rapids from a town that made excellent furniture into the calendar around which an entire national industry set its year. That gravity fed itself. Buyers went where the newest designs were shown first. Manufacturers built where the buyers already gathered. Workers who knew wood went where the manufacturers were hiring, three currents running the same direction, each deepening the channel for the others. A craftsman in a Cincinnati shop heard where the wages were better. An investor in New York, weighing where to place capital, heard where the buyers assembled. A retailer in San Francisco filling a showroom heard where the trade's reputation lived. Grand Rapids did not have to recruit any of them one at a time. The market recruited on its own schedule, twice a year for decades. By 1900, the rapids that had once turned nothing grander than sawmill wheels ran a river town crowded with furniture makers, most of the men running them drawn to the city rather than born in it, pulled in by the reputation that had walked out of Philadelphia in 1876. What none of them had solved yet, in a town still cutting the last of the pine that had started the whole enterprise, was where the wood itself would come from once the forests around the rapids finally ran out. Chapter 4. The Hands That Built the Name. By 1900, more than 40 furniture companies operated inside the city of Grand Rapids, strung along both banks of the river where sawmills had once stood alone. Berkey and Gay led the list in reputation, the same firm that had carried its Renaissance Revival suite to Philadelphia 24 years earlier. Whitcomb was there. So was Baker, and Williams Kemp, and American Seating, a company that would eventually turn its attention from parlor furniture to school desks, theater seats, and church pews. These were names a furniture buyer in Boston or San Francisco could say without hesitation. Names that meant the same thing in every showroom in the country: quality, made in Grand Rapids, no further explanation required. None of it ran itself. 40 companies needed hands, and the hands arrived from outside the county, then outside the state, then outside the country entirely. The Dutch came first, and in the largest numbers, drawn by letters sent home from earlier Dutch settlers already farming the West Michigan countryside, letters that described steady factory wages to men working land that did not always pay. Poles followed, then Germans, then Lithuanians, then Scandinavians, each group settling into its own corner of the city's west side, each finding work within walking distance of a rented room. Grand Rapids became one of the most heavily Dutch cities in the country, and the Dutch brought their churches with them the way any settled people brings the institutions that hold a community together. The Christian Reformed Church, transplanted directly from the Netherlands with its own doctrine and its own elders, became the moral authority of the working half of the city. Ministers held more sway over the men on the shop floor than most foremen did. That authority had not yet been tested against a factory owner's interest. It would be. Picture the east bank of the Grand River on a weekday morning in 1905. The mills of the 1850s are gone, replaced or swallowed whole by brick factory buildings 5 and 6 stories high, their windows running the length of each floor in unbroken rows. Every one of those windows is lit before dawn because the workday at Berkey and Gay, at Whitcomb, at a dozen smaller houses along the water begins before the sun clears the hills on the east side of the city. Steam whistles mark the start of the shift the way church bells mark a service. Inside, the noise never stops. Belt-driven lathes, carving machines, the flat slap of veneer presses closing on hardwood. Outside, wagons and the newer motor trucks line up at loading docks stacked with crated suites bound for Chicago, for Boston, for department stores in cities most of the men inside those buildings will never see. From a distance, the East Bank in 1905 looks like prosperity arranged in brick. Up close, it looks like a 60-hour week. That week ran 6 days, 10 hours a day, and it was paid by the piece rather than by the hour, which meant a slow day or a broken tool cost a man money. The fast days never fully returned to him. A skilled hand on the finishing floor could expect something in the neighborhood of $2 for that day's work. The men who cut the veneer did not own veneer furniture. The men who rubbed in the finish coat after coat did not own finished furniture. The men who nailed shut the shipping crates bound for New York and Boston and San Francisco did not own any of what they packed. The furniture leaving those doors was sold, advertised, and reviewed in trade journals as the finest manufactured in the United States. The people who cut it, glued it, carved it, and crated it earned, on a good week, enough to keep a family fed 2 miles from the factory floor, and not enough to furnish that house with anything the factory made. The arithmetic held for years: 60 hours, 10 a day, $2, piecework, a foreman with a stopwatch, and a church on Sunday that preached patience. It held through 1906, through 1908, through the boom years when new companies kept opening along the river, and the trade journals kept calling Grand Rapids the furniture capital of the country. It broke in April of 1911. Chapter 5. The strike the church did not join. On April 19, 1911, more than 6,000 furniture workers walked off the floors of Berkey and Gay, Whitcomb, and every major shop strung along the river, and did not come back. They asked for 3 things, and they asked for them in the same breath: an end to piecework, so a broken tool or a slow batch of veneer no longer cost a man a day's pay; an end to the firing of union men; an end to the blacklist that carried a name from one shop's front office to the next. So a man let go for organizing at Berkey, and Gay could not simply cross the street and start over at Whitcomb. Underneath the 3 demands sat a 4th, the one that made the others possible: a 9-hour day, paid at the 10-hour rate the men had worked for a decade. 6,000 was not a fraction of the trade. It was most of it, standing in the street instead of at the bench. The manufacturers did not answer any of it. They did not counter, did not meet, did not send word through the foreman about what might be acceptable. They closed the loading docks, let the crated suites already on hand carry the spring orders, and waited. A furniture company with capital behind it could sit idle for a season in a way that a family living 2 miles from the factory floor could not, and both sides knew the arithmetic before the first week was out. The Christian Reformed Church did not stay silent through that waiting. Its ministers, who held more sway over the men on the shop floor than most foremen did, used the pulpit that spring and summer to tell their congregations that the strike was a defiance of the order God had placed men under, that obedience to those set in authority was not a condition to be negotiated away because the terms felt unjust. The majority of the men standing outside the factory gates were Dutch American, and the majority of those men sat in Christian Reformed pews on Sunday. The same church whose doctrine had held the west side of the city together since the first letters came from earlier settlers describing steady wages now told its own parishioners, from the front of the room, to go back. Some did within weeks. Most held out through May, through June, through a July with no wages coming in, and an August that brought no offer from the manufacturer's side either. By the middle of August, 4 months after the walkout began, the strike had nothing left to hold it together. The men returned to the benches they had left, to piecework, to the 10-hour day paid as 10 hours, to foremen who had not forgotten which names had walked out first. Wages did not rise. Not that year, not the year after. The 9-hour day the strikers had asked for did not arrive in Grand Rapids furniture shops for another decade. The manufacturers did not simply return to the arrangement that had existed before April. They improved on it. In the aftermath, the furniture companies of Grand Rapids agreed among themselves, quietly and outside any contract a worker could read, to pay identical wages across every shop in the city. so a man with a grievance at one factory would find the same rate waiting at the next. Alongside the wage agreement came an identification system, a card and file kept on each man that tracked his output on the floor and, written beside it, his political sympathies. Whether he had walked out in 1911, whether he had spoken for a union since. A man's name, once entered, followed him the way the old blacklist had, except now it followed him with the full cooperation of every employer in the city rather than one. None of it showed on the outside. The furniture kept shipping. The trade journals kept calling Grand Rapids the furniture capital of the country, and within a decade the city would produce more of the name than it ever had before. The 1920s were coming, and with them the peak of everything the phrase Grand Rapids furniture had ever meant. What the boom did not advertise was what fed it. A labor force that had been taught in the summer of 1911 exactly how far it could push and exactly what waited on the other side, and a pine forest north of the city that was being cut faster than it could grow back. Chapter 6. The Math in North Carolina. By the middle of the 1920s, Grand Rapids furniture had become something more specific than a mark of quality. It had become a period. The city's showrooms filled with colonial revival, reproductions of 18th century English and American case pieces, highboys and drop-leaf tables and wing chairs pulled from museum collections and old estate inventories, sold not as new design, but as inherited taste, manufactured at a scale no 18th century cabinet maker could have imagined, and shipped to department stores in every region of the country. A family furnishing a dining room in what it believed was colonial style was very likely furnishing it with wood cut in Michigan and joined on the east bank of the Grand River. The name had never sold harder or wider than it did in those years. The money built things a visitor could see without ever entering a factory. Hospitals went up. Libraries went up. Mansions climbed the hillsides on the east side of the city, the kind of houses that took the wages of 100 piece-rate workers and turned them, eventually, into a single family's drawing room. The furniture families paid for wings, for endowments, for buildings with their names carved over the door in the same confident lettering the trade journals used to describe their product. Nothing about any of it. Not the hospital cornerstones, not the library shelves, not the mansions with their imported glass, suggested that the industry underneath was standing on a resource with a schedule of its own. A boom does not announce the arithmetic that will eventually end it. It just keeps building until the arithmetic announces itself. That arithmetic had two parts, and both were already running by the 1920s, quietly enough that no annual report needed to mention them. The pine that had built the sawmills and then fed the furniture factories after the sawmills gave out was being cut faster than it grew back, and had been for decades. Each generation of buyers sent its lumber crews a little farther from the rapids to find timber worth cutting, a little farther north, a little farther into country with worse roads and higher freight costs, until wood that had once floated down the river for the price of the labor to cut it now arrived by rail from hundreds of miles away, priced accordingly. The second problem was standing in plain sight the entire time. The factories that had been new in the 1880s were now 40 years old, and 40-year-old machinery in a building built for steam power does not modernize itself. Both problems were expensive to fix and cheap to ignore, and both stayed ignored. The industry did not lose its position to a better chair. It lost it to arithmetic performed 800 miles to the south, where a different set of manufacturers had figured out what Grand Rapids never had to. That furniture did not require Michigan at all. North Carolina sat inside its own pine forest, closer to the wood than the Grand River mills had been in 30 years. Its furniture workers earned, in 1929, something in the neighborhood of $821 a year, roughly half of what a comparable job paid in the North. Southern states courted the factories directly, with cheap land, favorable tax terms, and a promise stated plainly in the letters mills received: No unions? None. Ever. The defeat of 1911 had already taught every manufacturer in Grand Rapids what a workforce here could be made to accept. The South offered a cleaner version of the same lesson, without picket lines, without a pulpit denouncing its own congregation, without an identification system built to track a man's politics. It offered workers who never had to be held down at all, because they had never been given anything to push back against. Nobody in Grand Rapids voted on any of this. The decision was made in ledgers, one column of wages set against another, and ledgers do not hold press conferences. The pine kept thinning. The factories kept aging. And 800 miles south, a region with cheaper hands and its own trees kept adding capacity year over year patiently, the way a competitor builds an advantage while the incumbent is not looking. Through the 1930s and into the 1940s, that arithmetic would work itself out company by company, the great names of the furniture city closing one at a time. The most famous of them shut its plants in 1931. Chapter 7. The Factories That Did Not Burn. Berkey and Gay, the name that had walked out of Philadelphia holding the reputation of the whole American trade, shut its plants in 1931 and went into receivership the following February. It reopened in 1935 under new management, which is the part that makes the ending harder to see coming, and it kept going for another 13 years before declaring bankruptcy in 1948. The name was bought by a company in Louisville, and production stopped. Whitcomb held on longer, then merged, then shrank into something that carried the family name without carrying the workforce that had once made the name mean anything nationally. Company after company took the same path through the 1930s and into the 1940s, a merger that quietly absorbed a smaller rival, a sale to an out-of-state buyer with no attachment to the Grand River, a slow reduction in shifts never announced as a closing until the day it was one. Some houses folded outright, their names appearing one final time in a bankruptcy notice, their stock auctioned to buyers who never knew they were bidding on the end of an industry. None of it happened the way industrial collapse happens in the stories people tell about it. There was no fire on the East Bank, no headline about a factory floor giving way, no single dramatic morning when the whole trade came down at once. The buildings did not fall. They simply stopped. A boiler that had run 6 days a week for 50 years went cold and stayed cold. A loading dock that had moved a boxcar of chairs every afternoon went quiet, then quieter, then still. The brick did not know the difference between a factory and a building that used to be one. It just stood there, waiting for whatever came next. Something else in the city was about to change, in a part of its life the furniture trade had never touched. In 1945, Grand Rapids became the first city in the world to add fluoride to its public water supply, following a controlled trial measuring one thing: whether a mineral already occurring naturally in some water, added deliberately and in small amounts to drinking water, would reduce tooth decay in children. It did. Among children born in Grand Rapids after fluoridation began, the cavity rate fell by more than 60% compared to children drinking unfluoridated water in the region. The results held year over year, and cities across the country began doing to their own water what Grand Rapids had done to its own. A city losing the industry it had been named for produced in that same decade one of the largest public health results of the century, almost as a footnote. Nobody planned the timing. Nobody needed to. A city is not one story. It is several running at once, some rising while others fall, and 1945 in Grand Rapids held both, in the same pipes, under the same factories going quiet. The trade the city had built did not disappear, it relocated. By 1955, roughly 60% of American furniture was manufactured within 150 miles of High Point, North Carolina, a town that had been a minor rail stop when Grand Rapids was already shipping carved suites to Philadelphia. By 1980, High Point held the title outright, Furniture Capital of America, in the trade press and the buyers' calendars and the market weeks that had once drawn dealers to the Grand River. What Grand Rapids had assembled over nearly a century, from an 18-foot drop in a Michigan river to a name on tags in every department store in the country, North Carolina rebuilt for itself in about 40 years. A century to build, 40 years to lose. The city's black neighborhoods were carrying a different accumulation, one with no trade journal tracking its terms. Urban renewal projects had cut new roads through those neighborhoods in the post-war years, clearing blocks and displacing families with very little built to serve anyone displaced. The jobs that had once absorbed new arrivals, the same jobs the furniture trade had offered Dutch and Polish and German immigrants 2 generations earlier, had gone south with the factories, and nothing sized to replace them arrived where the neighborhoods were. In July of 1967, that accumulation reached its limit. Grand Rapids' black neighborhoods rose. Roughly 1,000 people involved, 44 injured, 30 arrested. The official report reached a conclusion stated plainly. This had been less a riot than a protest against neglect, against deprivation, against arbitrary control over a population with no say in the roads cut through its blocks or the jobs that had left its reach. The city that could not hold its own industry could still hold something else. What came next was furniture again, but built for a different room entirely. Chapter 8. The Furniture City Indoors. What rescued Grand Rapids was furniture again, but not the kind anyone had buried. Steelcase, Herman Miller, and Haworth, all 3 of them West Michigan companies, stopped competing for the American parlor and started building the American office, steel desks, filing systems, task chairs engineered for a body sitting 8 hours a day instead of a family gathered for an evening. It was not a new industry arriving to replace the old one. It was the old one, turned 90 degrees, walking through a different door. By the time the shift was finished, the region around Grand Rapids was producing somewhere near 60% of the office furniture sold in the United States, a second monopoly built out of the wreckage of the first. The skill had never left. That was the part outsiders kept missing when they wrote the city off in the 1970s and 1980s. Filing it next to Youngstown and Flint in the ledger of places that lost their reason to exist. A workforce that understood wood, joinery, finishing, and volume production does not forget those things because the product changes. It gets pointed somewhere else. The hands that had dovetailed a highboy drawer in 1925 were, within a generation, tooling steel drawer slides for a filing cabinet. The name survived the same way the workforce did. Furniture City did not disappear from the map. It moved indoors, into low buildings with no showroom windows, in office parks nobody photographs, doing the work the city had always done, under a sign nobody outside the industry bothered to read anymore. Not all of the second fortune came from furniture at all. J. Van Andel and Rich DeVos were 2 salesmen from the Grand Rapids area who built a direct-selling company called Amway into one of the largest private fortunes in Michigan. And unlike the money that had financed 100 years of lumber schooners and rail cars headed east, this fortune stayed exactly where it was made. A hospital carries the DeVos name. An arena carries the DeVos name. An institute carries the Van Andel name, and so does a museum on the west side of downtown. A city once owned, quietly and completely, by furniture families was now being reshaped by 2 families who had never bent a single piece of wood. In 1996, the Van Andel Institute opened its doors on Michigan Street, and the street around it began turning into a corridor known, almost immediately, as the Medical Mile. A children's hospital went up. A heart center went up. Research campuses tied to 3 separate universities lined the same pavement where lumber wagons had once queued for the sawmills. Grand Rapids had traded one resource industry for one institutional industry, and the difference was not cosmetic. Pine runs out. Labor migrates to wherever it is cheapest. An institution built around research, teaching hospitals, And a fixed campus does not pack up for North Carolina when the wage math changes. It stays, because staying is the entire premise of what it is. The old factories are still standing, and that fact alone tells most of the story to anyone willing to walk it. The Berkey and Gay Works, once the most famous furniture name in the country, is condominiums now, its brick shell intact, its interior cut into units with river views. The mills strung along both banks of the Grand Hold apartments, architecture offices, design studios, none of it furniture, all of it inside buildings raised to make furniture and simply outlived the trade by the better part of a century. Nobody tore them down. There was never quite enough reason to. Today, the city holds something close to 200,000 people, and it is growing while the state around it, county by county, keeps shrinking. The growth is coming from healthcare, from construction, from manufacturing, that has nothing to do with a lathe or a veneer press. It is not coming from furniture. Grand Rapids lost the industry that had defined it for 100 years, and it did not follow that industry into the kind of slow, permanent emptying that took hold of so many other American factory towns once their one trade left. The rapids that gave the city its name are still there, run now through a concrete flood channel that engineers monitor instead of millwrights, the same 18-foot fall reduced, on paper, to a line in a hydrology report. At night, the windows of the old Berkey and Gay Works glow amber, not from lathes running before dawn, but from the lamps of people who live inside them. A few blocks north, on Michigan Street, a hospital corridor runs bright and quiet around the clock where a lumber economy used to be. Downtown, the signs still read Furniture City on a skyline that has not led the furniture trade since before most of the people walking under those signs were born. The industry that gave the place its name is in North Carolina now, built on pine it did not have to ship in, and wages Michigan could not match. The name never followed it there. It stayed on the signs, over a river that still drops 18 feet and no longer turns anything at all.